This happened last weekend while camping in northern Utah. We had just gotten up to our campsite around 4 p.m. She had needed to go to the bathroom, so she walked up a little into the woods by another campsite that was empty. As she was walking up, I saw her stop for a minute and was looking around. I asked if she wanted me to go with her. We're both girls, and she said that was fine. Went to the bathroom and came back. Later that night, we were sitting around the fire with two other friends, and she seemed kind of on edge. I started poking fun at her, as that's how we joke with each other, and she told me she had seen something just past the tree line as she was walking up to go to the bathroom. She described it as having pale skin. The face looked like a mixture of human and canine and had black eyes. It was hunched over on all fours. Its back legs looked distorted, and she said that she could tell it would be tall if it were to stand on its hind legs, and she could see its spine protruding from its back. While telling her sister what she had told me, she also said that while she was up there, it had walked directly in front of her, stopped and stared at her, so she just came back to our campsite. Her sister says it was most likely a hairless bear or coyote, although bears aren't super common up here, or a wolf with mange. I personally don't know what to think. If anyone could shed some light or anything like that would be great. This happened in Grindstone, Pennsylvania, back in the 90s. I was about 8 years old, and my brother was 5-ish. We were in the country and lived on a couple acres with a farm on one side and thick forest on the other. So, I was playing outside with my little brother, and he went into the house. There, I was by myself, and I heard my mom calling for me. Her voice was coming from the woods on the other side of our fence. Basic farm fencing and nothing fancy. This freaked me out a little bit, but I climbed over the fence anyways and started walking towards the voice. Then, out of the blue, I felt like I was being watched. Got a really bad feeling. So quickly, ran back to the house and found my mom at the kitchen table. I asked her if she had called for me, and she said no. So I then told her what had happened, which led us kids being told to stay in the house for the rest of the day. Thinking about this now makes my hairs stand up on the back of my neck. When I was younger, I preferred to spend time at my great-grandmother's house rather than my own that I lived in with my grandmother. Being right next door, my grandmother would often let me spend the night with my great-grandparents to get me out of her hair. My grandparents had their own bedroom on one end of the house, and on the other end was the room in which I slept whenever I visited. This bedroom was big, to a 6 or 7-year-old, with a large bed that had sliding door cabinets for a headboard, and 2 large windows, one of which had a crate of older toys in it, mostly building blocks and the likes, that faced this side yard, which had several young pine trees. The other window faced a large barn out back and housed their camper and all manner of other things. Before I continue, I ought to mention that I'm a quarter Native American, of the Miami tribe to be specific. My mother was adopted by a family whose heritage was distinctly French. While my grandmother wanted my mother and I to have nothing to do with our heritage, my great-grandmother embraced it, never kept it from us, and even taught us a little bit about it. Me far less than my mother, since I was too young to understand, much before she passed. One night, when I was sleeping over at my great-grandmother's house, I woke up when the motion-detecting floodlight on the barn out back turned on. The room was flooded with light, and I could see everything clear as day. Unable to go back to sleep, I got up and decided to play with blocks until the floodlight went out and I could finally go back to sleep. For some reason, I felt a strange urge to look out the window into the side yard, so I climbed up on the crate under the window and peered out. There in the side yard was a young man. He was in his late teens, 17 to 19, with neatly cut straight black hair, nearly ear length. He wasn't dark-skinned, but he wasn't white either. He wore what looked like tan Carhartt overalls and appeared to be examining a young pine tree not 15 feet from the window. The tree wasn't very tall, maybe 8 or 9 feet, but the young man was carefully moving the bottom branches this way, and that as if to looking for something. I watched him for a minute or two, simply observing. I didn't feel frightened, rather I was curious. Then, the young man lifted his head and looked around. When he saw me, the strangest thing happened. He looked startled, then terrified. His eyes widened so far that I could make out the whites in the low light. There is no other way to explain what occurred after, other than the crazy sounding. He turned into a deer and bolted away into the darkness. He simply turned to his left, made a drop to all fours, and was a deer by the time what would have been his hands hit the ground. He ran off back beyond the barn. I don't remember the conversation I had with my great-grandmother about it in the morning, only that she seemed upset and was tight-lipped, and that she and my great-grandfather went out to look at the tree later in the day. They didn't find anything, and my grandmother didn't want to hear about it, so I shrugged it off. Years later, I would learn what skinwalkers are. I would think back to this young man, and how he could have been native, how his coveralls could have been deerskin. I would also think about my experience, and it didn't line up with other skinwalker encounters. I didn't feel any fear. I didn't notice a stench. No one called my name. Also, the young man seemed to be afraid of me. Then again, I suppose if I was looking for something, and I saw a small child staring at me at a window, I'd be a little freaked out too. As time went on, I had, for the most part, convinced myself that I had just happened to witness a teen boy hunting illegally on our property, and my startling him startled the deer he was after, and my child brain just processed it strangely. That is, until I decided to bring up the concept of skinwalkers with my mother. I had told her that I could have possibly seen one when I was a child if my memory could be trusted. When she said, "Oh, so you saw the Birdman too, huh?" My belief that I misremembered a teen boy hunting had shattered. She wouldn't say much about it when I seemed confused, simply stating, "Oh, there was an old bald man who would dance around on the roof with his belt made of feathers, and when I would go out there to yell at him for being so loud, he'd smile at me and fly off as a bird." That house was on land that was tribal before the family. I was adopted and moved into the area several generations ago. Artifacts coming to the surface every other time the big field behind my childhood home was plowed. Many others have had experiences there, including others of my own, though most of the other experiences seemed surreal, seemed to be things that could be brushed off as a coincidence, or me psyching myself up to see or believe something that wasn't there. But that young man who turned into a deer sticks with me, and has led me to be distrusting of deer. And not just because they're a road hazard. I have had many other strange occurrences with deer since then, but none so unbelievable as the shapeshifter in the coveralls. This was a recollection shared to me by my paternal aunt. This happened when she was a little girl. In the past, it wasn't uncommon for some Navajo families to have large nuclear families, about 8 to 10 siblings on average. Being the youngest, she recalls that it was her and her older siblings' duty to herd the sheep to their summer camp in the mountains. The kids were sent on foot, with the flock with sheepdogs. Many households had single cab trucks if they were lucky, so it would be unfair for the parents to take some kids and not the others. So only the parents rode in the vehicle and would await the kids at camp, hauling water and packing summer clothes and essentials such as imperishable food items. The majority of the res didn't have running water or electricity, no paved roads at all. She said it took a little under 2 days to walk on foot all the way to their sheep camp, if they took a shortcut through a canyon. On the first day, the sun was beginning to hang low in the sky, and they decided to make camp. She explained that back then, there were many Hogans scattered across the res that didn't have permanent inhabitants. They were built with the same intentions as the reasoning behind hunters' cabins, to temporarily provide shelter for hunters, or in this case, sheep herders. She said that these Hogans often had corrals for wary shepherds to house their sheep and livestock for the night, and continue on their way the next day. Ranchers and locals would upkeep these safe houses sporadically. She remembers clearly being instructed by her mother which Hogans were meant for that purpose, and the ones that had people die in them were off limits, making them uninhabitable according to Navajo tradition. In place of a door, there was a tattered moth-eaten blanket hanging from the doorframe. On the inside of the east-facing entrance was a plyboard. It was meant to be leaned up against the doorway and prevent wild animals, etc., from entering when occupied. Her older brothers gathered wood and started a fire. The smoke went up the stove pipe in the center of the Hogan. She remembers everyone being fatigued and tired after a long day's march. The dirt floor provided a familiar and comforting smell. They laid their sleeping bags out. The plywood board was up against the doorway. The brothers found long logs to leverage against the board. Staring at the smoke, escaping through the smoke hole, she could see the stars in the dark nighttime sky. The smoke hole was usually eroded away, making it seem wider than typical smoke holes. The dirt piled on the ceiling of the Hogan was probably eroded away by wind and rain, not being maintained regularly, packed down with fresh mud. The fire, just embers now. As she was drifting off to sleep, she said the sheepdogs that had accompanied them started to go crazy outside, howling and barking. She hears the thudding of a horse running around the Hogan. She is startled by a loud thud up against the board at the entrance. The brothers brace the doorway correctly. It doesn't give out. Then she hears a thud on top of the Hogan roof. Dust and debris begins falling from the old-fashioned Hogan roofing under the weight of whatever was walking on top. Her older brother, who is closest to her, whispers in Navajo to close her eyes. She said curiosity got the best of her, and she kept them open. Rocks the size of gravel started falling down the stove pipe. The skinwalker was deliberately throwing heavy rocks down the stove pipe, making loud metal scraping noises as they fell into the Hogan's fireplace. In the dark, her eyes dart from the low glowing embers of the fire upward, following the deep blackness of the stove pipe out the smoke hole. No glowing eyes, just the silhouette of a head and a torso of a skinwalker peeking in. She described it as having ears on the top of its head like a coyote or a dog, but the ears weren't of the canine variety. The ears were elongated and pointy. In the darkness, she said they looked like donkey ears, but were positioned on the coyote-like head. She spent a few moments frozen and staring at the creature, never having seen anything that resembled it in nature. It was unaggressive and only watched them for a while, eventually dismounting from the roof and the familiar thuds of horse hooves off in the distance. The dogs howling and whining after it, but never leaving their post at the sheep corral. I have some friends near Shiprock, New Mexico that are big into researching about Bigfoot and skinwalker sightings. They have been featured in shows like Finding Bigfoot, Coast to Coast AM, countless podcasts that speak about the paranormal, and on several History Channel programs. These people are the real deal. A few years ago, my wife and I were on vacation, and part of our trip would be driving through their town, taking advantage of this opportunity. We decided to spend a few nights out there to hang out with them. We met up, went to dinner, and talked about our personal paranormal experiences and recent Bigfoot sightings or skinwalker sightings. I wanted to experience searching for skinwalker evidence for myself, so during the course of our conversation, I asked if they would be willing to take me out on the field the following night and search for these elusive creatures. Being that most of them are Native American, they were very hesitant, and only one of them agreed. The rest of the group decided to meet us on my last night there to take me Sasquatching instead. The following day, my friend arrived at the hotel and picked me up around 5 p.m. We must have driven about a half an hour out of town, mostly through dirt roads, to a place known locally to have lots of skinwalker activity. By the time we reached the location, everything was dark. He shuts the truck off, and like in most paranormal investigations, we sit and we wait, trying to listen for anything out of the ordinary. For the most part, it was quiet. Other than a bunch of annoying crickets making noise, nothing much was really happening. My buddy told me about recent sightings and his own encounters with these medicine men. Long story short, after about an hour, he told me to get out of the truck, walk outside and towards the front of it to try and listen out for anything. He said that if anything happened, he would immediately turn the lights back on the truck and light up whatever might be there. Basically, he wanted me to be a human skinwalker bait. I was hesitant for a moment, but since I had a weapon on me, I thought it'd be okay. I also knew that bullets would do nothing to a skinwalker, unless they are blessed and have a specific type of white powder on them. Mine did not. Just as I had made my decision to get out of his truck, the night turned even darker. This wasn't a regular dark type of night. This darkness had a purpose to it. It felt extremely ominous. It also got extremely cold, and we both noted that all the little critters had gone quiet. After hesitating for a while, I decided to open the truck door to get out. But as I did, and had my foot ready to touch the ground, we heard a loud whistle. It wasn't a distant whistle, like the air brings towards you. This was next to us. It sounded like it was inside the cab of the truck. Obviously, I thought somebody had snuck up on us, or that my buddy was trying to mess with me. But when I looked at him, he had turned completely white. The expression on his face had totally changed. Seeing him that afraid naturally put me on high alert, and I tried to snap him out of it. But he seemed frozen in place. The whistling continued a couple of times, and I was screaming at my friend at this point. Eventually, he came to his senses and began to react to what was happening around us. He then immediately turned his truck on. We grabbed our flashlight and looked all over the place to see whatever the hell was out there, but of course, we found nothing. Feeling nervous and him being native, we decided to leave the place right away. The next day, him and a few other friends picked me up again and took me out at night to search for Bigfoot out near Shiprock Mountain. While investigating, we found what's known in the field as a Bigfoot nest. Inside of the nest were tons of dried out eaten animal carcasses and bones, mostly just deer. As we were trying to figure out what lived there, we suddenly heard a loud Bigfoot yelp. It wasn't a coyote or a mountain lion type of yelp. This yelp was felt in your bones. You could literally feel the vibrations in your chest. Of course, we all started searching around to see what it was. I didn't see anything, but two of my partners saw something moving upon the ridge. They were scared enough to draw and cock their weapons. About 10 minutes later, we began to hear several footsteps all around us. We couldn't see who or what it was because it was really dark, even with our flashlights turned on. And after hearing these footsteps getting closer and less afraid of us, we ended up leaving that area ASAP. These are my personal experiences and are 100% true. I don't expect anyone to believe me. My late friend JC Johnson and I talked many times about what happened. I'm still in contact with everybody who took me out those nights, and I still go out on the field here in Nevada, following Skinwalker, Bigfoot, and ghost sighting leads, as you can see. If anybody is interested in checking out some of our explorations, I'll be happy to show you. I'm a 24-year-old male, living in the Philippines. This is not even my story, but my dad's. It happened when I was a year old, and my mother was pregnant with my younger sister. We lived in a semi-rural area where we had a lot of relatives, and everybody knew each other in the neighborhood. My dad was out watering the plants in the backyard when he noticed a huge black bird perched on a low branch in a tree we used to have in our backyard. I know, big deal, right? Except the bird had unnaturally bloodshot eyes and looked back at my dad like it was thinking. My father, a bit unsettled, thought nothing more of it as he resumed his work and went inside afterwards. Hours passed and it was after dark. My dad went out again to do some more chores in our backyard. He was just finishing up when he noticed, in the alley between our house and the fence separating us from the neighbors, some small creature shuffling across a puddle of water on the pavement. Now we had a pet turtle, a red-eared slider, and my dad thought that the turtle somehow got out of its tank and was making its way across the alley. But on closer inspection, he realized that it wasn't our turtle, but, I kid you not, a crab. That's right, a crab, hundreds of miles away from any sea. It was huge, a dinner plate-sized crab. And what further unnerved my father was that this crab, just like the bird earlier in the morning, bloodshot eyes. The crab stopped to look at my dad with, according to him, the same intense stare the bird gave him. My dad, having had enough, quickly went inside, a bit creeped out at everything that had happened that day. The very next day, my father was speaking with the elders in the neighborhood at what he saw the previous day. They told him it was an aswang. Now, in rural areas of the Philippines, there are stories of aswangs, which are a kind of Philippine analog to vampire in Western folklore. They are said to be shapeshifters who enjoy feasting on human and animal entrails, but a favorite delicacy of aswangs are unborn fetuses. An aswang would crawl atop a roof at night, directly above a pregnant woman as she slept, slip its long tongue through an opening in the roof, and lap up the fetus like a mosquito would blood. As it happened, my mother was pregnant with my sister. One old man claimed he knew the aswang that paid a visit to our home. He told my dad that this particular one wasn't trying to eat my sister, but that it just liked being around pregnant women. Like my mom, because it was intoxicating to all aswangs. Doesn't make it less creepy though, and I'm glad that that aswang was not one of the malevolent ones. It was an interesting story though. I should pay more visits to my dad to hear more stories from him. I was at my friend's house. He lives around a lot of woods in a small town in New York. It was around 2 a.m., and me and my friend were just hopping off Modern Warfare 2 when we needed to put his dogs up for the night. So, we walked them to put them up. But we couldn't find the cat, and we didn't want the dogs getting a hold of the cat. So, we looked around outside until finally we found him on the front porch. So we put him inside and walked out to go back to my friend's house. My friend basically has 2 houses. So we stepped out of the door onto the back deck when we hear a cat about 50 yards away in the woods screeching like it's being attacked. So we assume it's his other cat, so we call his dad. He is a veteran in the Marines, basically meaning he has seen some stuff. So he comes out full on Marine mode with his AR-15 and flashlight scanning the woods when we hear a kind of like hissing, but not a hissing noise. It was almost like something big was out of breath. We got really quiet and listened. It just kept making a blowing noise. But then we noticed it was to the right of us 1 second, and the next it was right in front of us without making any noise. As anyone would be, my friend's dad was shook from it and fired off around 4 rounds into the woods. Things got quiet, but then seconds later, the noise resumed. But it was moving all over the woods and making no noise at all. Eventually, my friend's dad decided to push up to the woodline with a gun and flashlight in hand. The thing came right in front of him. He described it as being at around eye level with him. He's around 6 foot. But what really bothered me is that it wasn't afraid of gunshots or people. Eventually, after not ever being able to see what it was, we gave up and called it a night around 3 in the morning. The cat didn't come at all. We began walking back to his house when we heard it come from about 30 feet to our right, so we rushed to it to find nothing at all. Me and my friend and his dad go inside talking about how messed up the situation was. Me and my friend started doing some research and couldn't find any type of animal that really makes the noise. Just messes with my head that an animal or creature has the balls to stand its ground while people are surrounding it and shooting at it. It just made no sense at all, and still doesn't. It's the next night now, around 12:45 a.m., and my friend just brought some chicken and placed it on the woodline. We are sitting outside right now, waiting with a spotlight for something. Whatever it is, we want it gone. It just terrorizes the pets he owns. If anybody knows anything about this, please tell me. I'm sure it would help. Thanks. I live in the central Midwest of America, and before the quarantine, I've had no such encounters with anything in my town. I was driving home around 10 p.m., and my neighborhood is surrounded by thick woods. I live about a block away from this thicket. I am around 100 feet from my house, and as I glance in my rearview mirror, I see a black figure, almost like a living shadow, around 7 feet tall, human-looking body, inverted knees, and tall horns that resemble a goat's sprouting from the head. It wasn't looking at me as it was crossing the street, but even as I write this, I'm getting the same chills on the back of my neck. I glanced a second later, and it was gone, so I convinced myself that it was my imagination. I have seen shadow people before, but none this large or with horns. At around 2 a.m. that night, I'm scrolling through Instagram in my bed. My window is open, and I hear a low whistle. It is one note and only drawn out for about 3 seconds. This whistle repeats 4 times, and after it is done, I hear slow, heavy footsteps right underneath my window, second floor bedroom. I was paralyzed in fear for half an hour, so I did not look to see what it was. I'd like to think that my intuition is usually very good, and nighttime noises usually don't spook me. The next day, I asked my family if they had heard the whistling. My brother says that his room is next to mine, he did, but he thought it was me. Does anyone have any idea what it might have been, or know if anything that whistles in the night? I don't know what else to ask. I haven't seen this creature since, but the whistling has happened 2 other times, both at 3 a.m. There has also been multiple times where all the neighborhood dogs started howling at the same time, and then all stop at the same time. A few years ago, I used to have to do a long drive from northern Illinois down to western Kentucky about twice a month. I had gotten to the point to where I knew the drive like the back of my hand. Sometimes, it was actually a lot better to make the drive early evening and do a bulk of the 9-hour drive the next night, getting me there about 1:30, 2 a.m. No traffic, and in the summer, it was relaxing to drive with all the windows down. After crossing into Kentucky, there was about 2 hours of road without even highway lights. But, like I said, I'd done it so many times before. One of my last trips, I had been heading down that stretch and I had my brights on. In the distance on my driver's side of the shoulder, I could see what I thought was a deer. Got a little closer and realized it was a wolf. Now I'm coming up on it and it's on all fours, but its back had to be almost level with the roof of my sedan. I thought, holy cow, that thing is huge. Now I'm probably doing about 80 miles an hour, and I swear we lock eyes. I can feel him look directly at me. I'm getting closer and closer, and now I can actually see his teeth. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, that this was an actual animal. Then as I'm probably 50 feet from this thing, about to pass it on the driver's side shoulder, it stood up on 2 legs and started staring directly into my eyes. I passed, and the rest of the drive I tried to figure out what I'd seen, or should I loop back? I never told anyone the story because most people would just say, "Oh, it was late. Your mind was messing with you." But still to this day, I won't forget how long that stare down was. I can't help but think I didn't catch him by surprise. More like he wanted me to see him, and if he really wanted to stop me, he could have. I don't know where else to share my story, so I've just come here to the first website that pops up when you search Goatman. I don't really care where I post it. The only thing that matters is that it's posted. My name is Richard, but if you don't mind me doing so, I'd prefer to skip the pleasantries and proceed with my needed story. I first came to know the tale of this frightful creature around a year ago during a school expedition that took us hiking through some desolate forest somewhere in rural England. The trip was actually completely normal, and nothing disturbing happened whatsoever. But as we sat down at the campfire one night, one of the students, whose name I didn't know, suggested that we tell some scary stories around the campfire. As cliché as it sounded, we all agreed and decided to take turns. The student who came up with the idea stated that they would go first, as they had a pretty good story saved up for such moments as this. They told a tale of a humanoid creature that, for the most part, possessed a body of a human, but that it had the head and legs of a goat. Naturally, it was labeled as the goatman, and the student went on to speak of the creature and its endeavors into the awful. This story is the only one I remember from that night, with the rest of the stories all being based around the same generic plot concerning a bloodthirsty creature who was on the hunt for human flesh. Easily forgettable, to say the least. What scared me about the story of the goatman and successfully imprinted into my memory was that it supposedly didn't kill people, or rather it didn't kill them straight away. The goatman could shapeshift into any creature, be that a person or an animal. It didn't even need some ritualistic such as a drop of blood or anything crazy. It could just transform at will. I vividly remember the student ending his tale by reminding us once more that the goatman preferred to mentally exhaust its prey before ending their lives in a variety of unimaginable, gruesome ways. Although it would very rarely show itself in its true form, the student said. Victims would typically see it take dozens of appearances throughout very short time periods. This tale was slowly but surely pushed to the back of my mind over the next couple months, with me sitting important exams and entering a transition period where many students would leave my school in order to pursue their studies elsewhere, being replaced by a more optimistic bunch who were so happy throughout their first few days at school that it made the rest of us uncomfortable. You can relax though. They weren't brain-eating aliens sent from another planet to destroy the human race, and their blissful mood soon vanished, being replaced with a harsher, more realistic one that suited the repetitive nature of school life. During this transitionary period, a number of people I knew left the school, with some of my close friends throwing goodbye parties with other people, such as the student who first introduced me to the tale of the goatman, practically vanishing. The story of the goatman was forcefully reintroduced to me today during a trip I made to the National Art Gallery with a small group consisting of my two closest friends. We made our way through the various sections of the gallery over the course of a couple hours, but weird and seemingly unexplainable things would occasionally happen to the group of us. The most alarming of these things was most certainly when I witnessed firsthand my friend James exiting the room containing sunflowers through a door located on the right side of the room, before reappearing through the door on the opposite side of the room only moments later. This feat was clearly impossible due to the way the building was laid out, but when the remaining two of us started walking towards James and questioning how he had just done that, he quickly backed out of the door without uttering a word. We concluded this was a practical joke, but before we could exit the room after, James, he shouted to us from the right-hand side of the room that he had initially exited out of. He yelled, "You guys coming or not?" and was seemingly clueless when we caught up to him and questioned him about the events that had just transpired. I was somewhat shaken by this initially, but refused to accept that it could have been anything but a joke. Whilst this was the only largely creepy thing that had occurred within the gallery, with the only other noticeable occurrences being a few people smiling at us in creepy ways, and one woman who supposedly walked up to my friend Charlotte and began talking to her in a language Charlotte can only describe as cryptic. Things only got worse once we decided to depart. As we drove back to our town, I stared out the window and dozed off, suddenly awakening out of nowhere as the car stood stationary at some traffic lights. Rubbing my eyes, I gazed out of the window once again, but was jolted awake when I saw the kid who had first told me the story of the goatman all those months ago, staring at me from the other side of the road. He had an eerie grin on his face, but in true horror movie fashion. I did the stupidest thing imaginable and opened the car door before running up to him and smiling back. Fully prepared to catch up with him and asked where he'd been. I hadn't thought about the goatman so far that day, up until I saw the boy from the hiking trip standing there, and looking back on it, I'm pretty sure that the goatman knew this too. He wasn't willing to let me forget. Just before I made it to the other side of the road, a car came speeding out of nowhere, passed right in front of me, missing me by mere inches. I flinched and impulsively clenched my eyes shut, only opening them when I sensed the danger had passed. I almost jumped out of my skin when I focused on where the boy whose name I didn't know had been standing only come face to face with an elderly man, who, despite his drastically changed features, wore the same creepy smile. I turned and sprinted back to the car, where my 3 friends had observed the entire event. I knew I couldn't have been hallucinating when I saw the looks of abject terror etched across their faces. I jumped in, closed the door behind me, and James slammed his foot down on the gas. The 4 of us sat in silence, with the only conversation we had occurring when James attempted to pull into his driveway before Charlotte shouted at him to turn their car around and head towards the nearest police station. He began to question her, but she cut him off, and the desperation in her voice told us that something was very wrong. James kept his eyes on the road as he drove towards the station, and Charlotte looked out the window as she sat next to him, occasionally catching my gaze as she glanced back in my direction, a look of unwavering concern overshadowing her usually calm demeanor. We eventually reached the police station, and I got out of the car. We reached the door to the station before Charlotte grabbed me and twisted me around, forcing me to look back at the car. I caught a glimpse of a figure dragging its leg behind it as it shuffled off in the other direction, features indistinguishable in the cover of the night. "What?" I asked her as I observed the figure, somewhat rationally assuming it was somebody departing from the police station after having been interviewed regarding an injury for their leg. "Richard," she whispered to me, voice evidently close to giving out and with tears in her eyes. "That thing, it was in the car with us. Did you somehow not notice it? There were 3 of us in the car when you arrived and began to leave the gallery, but a while after you got back, I caught sight of it. It was sitting next to you in the back. I was watching it from the wing mirror in the car, and it just sat there, smiling at you for the entire journey with this horrible, indiscernible smile." Her voice trailed off as she finished her sentence, and I was left more terrified than I'd ever been in my entire life. There was no way I couldn't go an entire hour-long car journey without noticing somebody sitting next to me. It was impossible, and I knew it. Yet it had happened. My feet gave out from the sheer panic I was experiencing, and I collapsed to the floor with an audible thud. Now, my eyes were filling up with tears too, but I swear I saw the silhouette in the distance turn around to look at me one final time before shuffling off into the night. The police heard us out, but took no action, as all we really had to talk about was a couple of people smiling at us creepily and an account of somebody slipping into our car, having been noticed by the person who sat in the passenger seat in front, and yet somehow evading the sight of James and myself, despite supposedly staring at me for the entire journey. I explained to them the story of my hiking trip and of the goatman, but it was met with raised eyebrows despite my pleading and protesting. By this point, I would have started questioning my own sanity had I not been sitting next to 2 others who had shared this horrific experience with me. Eventually, the police said they'd come and visit each of our houses the following morning for more information after we had slept, and that we should call them if anything else out of the ordinary happened. They escorted each of us home, and we decided to reconvey the following day at James's house in order to try and piece together what had happened over the course of the day. I was the last to be dropped off, and the officer who was driving the squad car told me that they'd keep a unit on standby throughout the night, and then it would be dispatched to my address immediately should I dial the emergency services. He flashed me a smile as he rolled up the window of his car, and I froze momentarily before shrugging it off. I was able to muster a faint laugh as I looked at my predicament, with me now being so paranoid that I was coming within inches of a heart attack whenever somebody did so much as smile in my direction. However, my fears were very reasonable, and maybe, just maybe, I was correct to have been scared by his smile. I dare not look back as I made the long walk up my driveway and into my house, being so sure to lock and bolt the door behind me before searching the entire house for any open windows. Every window in the house was closed, but that didn't stop me from locking them too. I tried sleeping in my room with the lights on, but I found that my mind refused to rest, instead desired to wander. I came up with endless explanations, but there was one so terrifying that I was forced to get out of my bed and roam around the house, keeping any suspicious movement going on outside. Perhaps it should have been obvious to me earlier, but I'd had so much going through my head that I'd only just come to the realization that I'd never seen the boy who told me about the goatman and appeared to be on my side of the road, anywhere apart from on that hiking trip. Desperate to be proven incorrect, I grabbed my yearbook and began frantically tearing out the pages. Minutes later, I was a sobbing mess, having gone through the entire yearbook but not found a single person resembling him. Now it was clear to me. The goatman himself was the one who had told me the tale of the goatman, and the boy he was capable of shapeshifting into must have been a past victim, or something along those lines, seeing as I'd never seen him in my life before or after the night where he first told us the story. At least, that was the case, up until today. As I'm writing this, I'm sitting at the table in my living room. I have all the doors locked and windows bolted, with a piece of furniture propped up against each one to prevent anyone or anything from entering. I also have the radio on loud to drown out all the sounds emanating from upstairs, those being the occasional creaking of the floorboards and other noises which I cannot identify. To be fair, I do live in a very old house, so perhaps those sounds can be rationalized. I have my mobile next to me, just one tap away from calling the police. It's 8 p.m., and that means my parents should get home from their evening out in around 2 hours. I'll just sit tight until then, staring out the window into my garden. Thankfully, nothing can get into my house without walking up the drive and passing through the well-lit front garden first, so I'll be able to call the police immediately if anything or anyone who I don't recognize starts approaching. My dog is lying flat on the floor a couple of meters from me, staring up at me with a vacant expression. I think it can sense fear. Nothing can get into my house without making an awful amount of noise. I know that now. I will have time to flee and call the police on my mobile before anything bad happens to me. You see, there's just one problem that I blatantly ignored during my overanalysis of the situation. My parents took our dog with them on their trip. Whatever is currently lying meters away from me on the kitchen floor knows it cannot possibly be my dog, and as it begins to convulse, I fear it's realized that I've just come to the same conclusion. First off, I live in Washington, so I was spending a few days with my friend Jay, his sister D, his mom S, stepdad P, and their dog. Around 2ish in the morning, Jay, D, and I had just been lying around, trying to fall asleep, when we heard a weird barking noise. The bark sounded like their dog, so I asked if they heard him barking. They said yes, and we all agreed it was the dog in my mom's room. But then we got a text from S, saying and asking if we heard that bark. We said yeah, and then asked if it was the dog. She said no, the dog was next to her snoring. So then we asked if it was P. She said P was asleep, and he was silent. She was scared and asked us to check it out. So we went to her room and checked out the glass door to the balcony, and there was nothing there. Then we looked in her closet, and nothing. We asked if maybe it was the wind, and S said all the windows and doors were closed. We couldn't figure it out, so we all just went back to bed. But then we heard crunching outside, where there is this gravel trail we walk the dog on. I looked out the window, and nothing was there. The sound stopped that night, but Dee had a dream where she was being chased by someone. The thing is, we all could have sworn that the bark sounded like their dog, but as if a human was making it. I'm trying to understand what I just saw. I just need some experiences that are similar to mine. I live in the countryside. Me and my brother were walking back home, and it was just a few minutes past midnight. There's no houses besides where we live, just fields, bushes, and trees. We were walking, and I felt something was wrong. I felt like something was watching us, but I didn't think too much of it. Then we heard a noise. I can't explain it because it was nothing I'd heard before. My brother said it was a faraway gunshot, and I just believed him. He later said that he just too said it to calm me down. We kept walking with the flashlight on, and he put some music on to try and calm me down. At one point, I look on my right side, and I see this flashlight, like a person was holding it, but you could clearly see there was nobody holding it. My brother turned off the flashlight, and we kept looking at it. The light turned over into two, and it seemed like it was a car which turned toward us. The light went over us like somebody was pointing flashlights. We panicked but didn't move. A few seconds later, the lights just disappeared. We started to walk faster towards our house, but coming over the hill, we seen this creature on the left side of the road, just completely still. My brother didn't wear glasses at the time. He said he just saw something like an orb changing forms, but I was wearing glasses, and what I seen still makes me want to puke. I saw a luminescent humanoid being, which was something I'd never seen before. The thing started changing its form and became something like a fox, going from one side of the road to the other. At this point, we were freaking out. I started to run towards the house as it was just a few meters away, but my brother stopped me to calm me down as I was shocked. When this happened, we were in our driveway, and I was with my back to it. He was holding my shoulder, telling me to calm down, but then he looked towards the darkness and he ran away. I didn't have the balls to look back, so I ran after him and towards the door. He gave me the key, and I tried to open the door with my hands, shaking, which was absolutely hard. He said that he'd seen the creature standing up, and that it looked like a man, but it wasn't a man at all. Did anybody have any encounters similar to this? This happened just last night, and I still can't quite explain what happened. I'm shocked and scared. Hello. I live in the more wooded area of New York. I heard stories about skinwalkers only throughout the South and the drylands. My mom and I believe our house was built above a burial ground of some sort. We live on a hill, and there's a long line dug into the largest rock, a very thin line that leads off to the edge of the rock, almost like a sacrifice space, I believe. The rocks look messy and clumped together, but there are way more rocks stacked beneath the dirt. It goes all the way around the biggest rock, and could I ever come across a skinwalker or possibly a wendigo up north? I know they are completely separate from one another, but I couldn't find any good information about certain cairns or structures. If this is indeed a Native American burial ground, would it be considered sacred or protected spot? If there was a skinwalker encounter, would the grounds make a difference of some sort? Just throwing it out there. I met my best friend Ben when I was 19. We started a degree in music together and had absolutely nothing in common, which we loved about each other. What shocked us was how in sync our childhoods had been. From being born 2 weeks apart to the age of 12, we shared a lot of experiences even though we never met. I remember Ben telling me about a VHS he used to have with cartoons on it, saying how obscure it was and how I'd love it. I replied that I knew exactly which VHS he was referring to, and also still had a copy of it. This sort of thing happened a lot between us, so we liked to quiz each other from time to time, and then joke about how different we were for our identical upbringings. One night, when I was staying over at Ben's house, we got on the topic of kids' ghost stories. I love creepy stories, but Ben hates them. So, the conversation was slow going at first. We started with the usual stories kids in the neighborhood spread. It was funny how many of our town's stories were exactly the same for being opposite sides of the city and river, 10 miles from each other. The dilapidated places were always haunted. We both had heard about a one-eyed black cat nobody owns that watches the children who play out. The list of stories went on, and so did the similarities. Ben, surprisingly, into the discussion. So, you've ever heard of this story? Etc., to which I confirmed or told my town's slightly different version of the story. That's how the night progressed. After we exhausted the conversation, he ended with, "Even to this day, I'm scared of the dogman, so please tell me you've heard that story too." I just remember being dumbfounded, saying I had no idea what a dogman was. As far as I'm aware, the dogman story is just in Ben's town. We tried looking on the internet, but Ben was too easily freaked out by the pictures and scary stories that popped up as we searched. The Dogman really grabbed my attention. Usually kids' ghost stories get into so much detail, like the color of the ghost's dress, or the exact way the hair hangs over the ghost's eyes. But there wasn't much info about Dogman. The details were vague. His words at the time were something like, "The older kids who were allowed out the street told us about Dogman, who stood around in the alleys at night, and the older kids were shamelessly scared to go there when it got dark." Obviously, it was thugs or druggies, I explained. But he was adamant. No, because they ran away when they noticed the kids watching them. They'd climb up the high walls of the back alley into people's backyards really fast, without making any noise. The older kids wouldn't talk about it unless pushed. He said their feelings seemed too real to make it to a joke to scare the younger kids. His childhood friend Wes claimed to have saw one too. The story goes that the Dogman would be found standing in the small groups and more solitary in the middle of an alley, looking for scraps of food, not doing much else. Ben seriously thinks he saw one with his mom one day walking back from shopping. Apparently, it was in a fenced-off area where a block of flats had been demolished just a few years prior. At the opposite side of this land, he saw a skinny, hunchbacked man cupping his hands full of water from a stream which ran through the plot, washing his long, greasy hair, almost ritualistically. Even though he didn't see the homeless man's face and was quite far away to make out details, he swears something about the man wasn't quite human. I blamed a child's imagination and exaggerated memories, but he swears it. He showed me the area that next morning. If he and his mother are remembering correctly, I have no idea why even a homeless man would wash his hair in that dirty stream. I first met Wes a few weeks after that night that I learned about the Dogman, and didn't hesitate to ask for his first-hand account of the Dogman. It was the main reason I decided to meet him, after all. His description was similar to Ben's, but his encounter was far more close up. Wes lived from the local corner shop than Ben and used to take a shortcut through an alley when he walked there. The wheelie Ben's route that day, he said he could hear a cat or dog fending on some discarded food behind one of the bins. It happens a lot, and everybody knows to keep a distance so the dog won't get aggravated and attack. But Wes said the dog didn't look right. He only got a quick glance before it ran behind a wall with a rotten roast chicken hanging from its mouth. According to his memory, it was running more like a hyena than a normal dog, with its shoulders held much higher than its hips. The snout was too short, and the ears were more elven than a dog's. He can't remember if the creature had fur or not, but it definitely was naked. Not long after, he overheard the older kids talking about Dogman and realized what he had saw. I like Wes. He has a doubting attitude akin to mine, and admitted his memory may have been influenced by the older kids' stories. It could have just been a normal dog struggling to carry a whole chicken away after being startled. The story lay dormant, not mentioned for months after I spoke to Wes. In that time, I had moved away and have only managed to visit Ben 3 times since then. The last time I met with him, we decided to go to the local takeaway in the early hours of the morning, and I got my very own encounter of what could have been the Dogman. Right on that same abandoned plot where Ben saw the homeless man bathing, there was a decent-sized fire burning. I could make out possibly 3 silhouettes huddled around the flames. Ben's area is pretty rough, so this isn't an unusual sight, but I don't know how to describe it. Those figures weren't moving naturally. My view wasn't great because Ben wouldn't move closer than we were, but I swear those silhouettes never stood completely upright. We watched them for about 5 minutes. They were hunched over with their backs up, warning and warming their gloves and hands by the fire with their hoods up. I remember one of them moving closer to the fire while keeping its hands on the ground. It would have been easier to just stand and walk closer, but it shuffled awkwardly using its arms. Everything about their movement was indescribably awkward. I was so excited. It had to have been the Dogman. I didn't want them to spot us, so we left pretty soon after that. But I forced Ben to visit the bonfire with me the next day. There was just a milk crate that sat next to a charred circle on the ground. Nothing to prove these beings were inhuman. Strangely, there were bones in amongst the smoldering papers and branches that had been burning the night before. We could make out scooty handprints where at least one of the homeless people had presumably crawled over to the charred ground. The trail of handprints led away from the bonfire and faded after a couple of meters. That was all we found. We walked away feeling slightly silly, laughing at how we had probably been stalking a trio of drunk tramps. However, Bent's realization unnerved us terribly. As the handshell faded, he pointed out a large paw print becoming more and more prominent in the middle of the fading handprints. Then, it struck me why I found their gait so weird the night before. As the man had walked closer to the fire, he placed his feet in exactly the same spot where his hands had been. We stared in shock, not sure what to make of the trail. Then the yelps and growls of the dogs fighting came from a bush uncomfortably close to us. I'm not ashamed to say we ran away crapping ourselves. Maybe it was just a pack of dogs. We didn't care to look, and I'm never going back there to find out. This happened in Arizona, of course, about 7 years ago, while on our biannual fishing trip to Black River out in Fort Apache Indian Reservation. Each year, we take this little dirt road, only accessible in a 4Runner, all the way until it ended. The only people we ever saw out there were cattle ranchers that never really went past the tree line, which was about a half-hour drive from where we camped. Needless to say, we were always way out in the boonies. There was one way in and one way out, and we camped at every end of the road. This trip in specific was our 5th year going to the same spot. Twice a year, this would be about our 11th week-long trip at that spot. We never saw another soul outside of our party of 5, all 10 other times. We'd get up super early, sometimes a little before sun, to get everything ready to go and fish all day, wanting to get as much fishing in as possible before dark. This experience happened on day 3 of 8. We were up eating some breakfast, instant oatmeal packets and protein bars for those who happen to care, and getting our gear ready to go for the day. This was when the sun wasn't up quite yet. We still had lanterns and headlamps on to see. With all of us right there, we hear footsteps coming from the road. We all look up and see 2 middle-aged Native American men walking down the road. No gear with them, both looking straight forward and not even acknowledging our existence. They walked past us up along the trail along the river. We were spooked because we'd never see anyone out there in the many times we'd been. We figured they may have been camping a bit further up the road. Went down the same path a little bit later, and about an hour in, we hear rustling from the other side of the river. Then, we see a fawn burst out of the trees and start running downstream. A few seconds later, 2 very mangy coyotes come sprinting out of the same spot, chasing the deer down. They eventually cross back into the woods, and they disappear from view. Over the next 5 days, we never saw these 2 guys again. If they had gear, I wouldn't be suspicious of this. However, to avoid us on the way back, they would have to go extremely out of the way to get back to that road, and it really just wouldn't be feasible. On top of that, the coyotes did chase the fawn back downstream to where the road was. When my grandmother was younger, she was walking home from school when she got to the farm that she lived on. She saw the figure of her mother out on the field, waving to her and yelling her name, beckoning her to come to her. My grandmother ran into the house to leave her backpack before going out to the field. When she got to the kitchen, her mother was there cooking. There was no way that her mother managed to get to the house before her. Could it have been a skinwalker or a wendigo? This happened in northern Sweden, so it shouldn't be possible that it was a skinwalker, right? It was her mother's voice as well, so it couldn't have been somebody else.